Hi everyone, thanks for watching. I'm Lauren and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my hints and tips for making the Sew House 7 Remy Raglan top. So some of you will be watching this video as you've got it as part of a kit with everything in it you need to make a really lovely version, or it might be that you bought the video as a sort of separate standalone thing. Either way, just remember the video doesn't replace the instructions that come with the sewing pattern anyway, so do use the video alongside the instructions, and I hope that seeing some of the steps up close and just learning about using and working with the specific fabrics that we've chosen for the kit as well just give you some additional hints and tips and skills that you can use for other projects. I'll run through the contents of the kit, and if you did just get the video from us, then it'll act like a little bit of a checklist of some things that you might want to make sure that you've got, and then I'll go through the main key construction stages and talk a little bit about the sizing and the different variations and little alterations that you can make to the pattern as well. But it's a really lovely basic pattern to have. It's nice to have one of those sort of tried, true and tested simple tops that are quite easy and simple to make and are suitable for lots of different types of fabric as well. You can really get your money's worth and your value out of a pattern, and I would say that this one is one of those patterns. I'm sure you want to make it again and again, and yeah, it's a really useful one to have if you're looking to try and build up a more of a me-made wardrobe. So if you did get the kit from us, then inside there you will find a pack of machine needles. So I used the size 70 with both of the types of fabric that were included in the kit, and that worked really well. And then you've also got a matching thread too. And then we've also given you a length of bias binding for the neckline, and this is in a double gauze. So it's specifically a cotton double gauze bias binding. And this is just because the specific fabrics that we included with the kit, because they've got embroidery detail on them, we just felt that they weren't going to be ideal for making binding with. So if you're getting your own supplies, you're making another version in the future, you don't necessarily have to get additional binding, but specifically for the ones in the kit, we thought that it would just be a little bit easier and better if we gave you a length of that binding. Now you'll notice that they're not an exact colour match, they're more toned together, but because the binding is all on the inside of the neckline, it's not visible from the outside of the garment, then it does work really nicely. And you can't see the binding once you're actually wearing the garment. So if you're feeling like, oh, they don't quite match, I think that it works really well, and you can see from the samples that I've made as well what it's like when you actually come to wear it. So hopefully that gives you some reassurance there. And then you've also got one cute little button as well, which is if you're doing the keyhole neckline opening. And then you've got a little me-made label that you can choose to sew in your project. You've got your A0 pattern printout, and then you do also get access to all of the PDF files for this pattern as well. So the instruction booklet itself is attached to your order confirmation email, and you can also view it when you log into our website and look under the files and videos section. And then to actually get the pattern files themselves, there is information on how to do that and a code that you can use to access them from the Sew House 7 website. So you can access them from there for free because you've got them as part of the kit, and then you can store the files wherever you want to store them on your computer or devices at home. And then onto the fabric that we included in the kit. So we had 3 colorways of this really pretty blossomy embroidered voile or gauze. So it's quite, the base of it's quite a sort of loose weave fabric, and it's quite textured. It's got quite a lot of depth to it. So when you look closely, you'll see a few different colour tones in the base cloth of this fabric, which is pretty lightweight, and it's got quite a loose open weave as well. But then it's quite heavily embroidered with these really pretty little blossom flowers. And then the other fabric that we had is a cotton double gauze, so it's 100% cotton, and then just a little bit more sparingly, it's got these really beautiful embroidered little sprigs of foliage, I guess, something botanical on it, which is really lovely as well. So both are lovely types of fabric to make with this pattern. but it is really versatile. You could definitely stick with more like the cottons, which are a bit more structured. It would look nice, really nice in a cotton lawn or a cotton linen, or you could go for something that's got a little bit more drape and sort of swish to it, so a viscose linen, or just a woven viscose as well would work really nicely. So yeah, as I said before, a nice versatile pattern that you can combine with lots of different fabrics to get lots of different looks. Now, in terms of pre-washing the fabric, I would recommend that you do pre-wash it. I pre-washed all of mine on 30 degrees on a regular cycle in my sewing machine, and I tend to overlock the cut edges of the fabric just to minimise on any fraying there, and then try to dry it as flat as possible. You don't want it to sort of stretch or distort out of shape as it's drying, and then you can give it a nice iron before you come to press it. Now, with the cotton double gauze one, the pinky one, because that is cotton, that can stand a fair amount of heat with the iron. I'd make sure you've got water in your iron so that steam's generated. But with the blossom embroidered one, just be a little bit more cautious with the heat on your iron. Again, do make sure there's water in there so that steam's generated. Obviously, all irons are going to be slightly different in terms of how much heat they can generate. But what I would maybe suggest that you do is on like a little offcut or on a sort of corner of fabric, once you've maybe laid your pattern pieces out and you know you're not going to use that, is just test it with the temperature in your iron, because it's getting the balance between making sure that it's hot enough that you can actually press the fabric, but that you don't singe it. The other thing that I would also suggest doing when it comes to ironing is making sure that your iron is nice and clean as well. Making sure you've got no burn or scorch marks on there, just because the fabric is textured with the embroidery, and if you do have sort of older kind of dirty marks or sticky marks on your iron, sometimes it can more easily come off with embroidered type fabrics because they're more textured and they're raised. So yeah, do make sure that you clean your iron. There's various different ways to do that. You can buy specific iron cleaner. We sell a prim version of that in the shop, and some people use paracetamol tablets as well to sort of scratch and scrape it off. So yeah, it's just something to watch out for. Now, when it comes to choosing a size and a variation, I would say that it's got a fairly sort of loose fit. It doesn't have any darts in it, so it's not really sort of shaped or sculpted around the bust or around the waist. So it does have, you know, a fair amount of ease through the waist and into the hips as well. So if you are falling between sizes, I would probably say go more off of the bust size measurement for picking a size. And if you're finding that you're falling across a few different sizes, just check the garment measurement, the finished garment measurements chart, because as I said, it does have a fair amount of roominess and looseness around the waist and the hips. So it might be that you don't necessarily have to grade between sizing if there's still sort of going to be enough ease there. Now, I found that it did come up really true to size. All of the samples that I made are in the size that corresponds to my body measurements, and I feel like that fits really well. I did just tweak a couple of little things when it came to the hems on the sleeve and on the main bodice as well. So in the version that I'm wearing just now, I did shorten it by 1.5 inches, so I cut 1.5 inches off, but then I also deepened the hem as well. So I did a 1/2 inch turning and then a 1 inch turning, so it's just got a little bit of a thicker, deeper hem. The hem allowance that comes in the pattern anyway is I think it's about 1/2 inch/centimetre twice, so it's a little bit narrower. So yeah, I just made it a little bit more cropped and boxy and did a deeper hem on this version. So that's something that's fairly easy to customise once you've actually made it as well. And then the other alteration that I did on the cuffs, so you can have a longer sleeve cuff, like a 3/4 length sleeve cuff, and then a shorter one, which is what I've got here. And you'll see in the instructions that it tells you to fold it back to create the cuff. Now, what you can do so that you see the right side of the fabric when you fold back that cuff is just effectively create a much deeper hem. And I found this worked a little bit better, just to make sure that when you turn it back, you're not seeing the back of the fabric. Now, obviously, certain fabrics that are maybe more like double-sided or don't necessarily have an obvious right or wrong side, it wouldn't be as big a deal. But, you know, I would say definitely if you're using something like a printed viscose fabric, which does have a very clear obvious right and wrong side, then it is good to do this little alteration. So what I would suggest that you do is straighten out the sides of the sleeves so that everything doesn't get bunched up when you turn it back. So if you measure 4.5 up 4.5 inches and straighten it out for here. This works on for the short and 3/4 length sleeve, remember, not the gathered one. And then just make sure that this line is parallel to the grain line. So then when you come to actually hem the sleeve, you'll press it back by 1/2 inch and then press it back by 2 inches, so it's like a really deep hem that you're creating. And then when you fold it back by 1 inch, you'll be seeing the right side of the fabric. So I'll remind you about that again when we come to it later, but in terms of preparing your pattern to cut out, if you want to do that on your sleeve hem of the shorter length or the straighter 3/4 length sleeve, then I would suggest doing that alteration to the pattern now before you cut out your fabric. Then you do also have the gathered sleeve option as well, which is a really lovely version to do. It's quite full, you know, it is quite a full sort of puff loose sleeve, and in this really sort of lightweight fabric, I think it works lovely. It's really, really nice. So obviously if you were making another version in a more structured fabric, maybe one that was like a cotton linen that had a bit more weight and structure to it, that fullness would be held a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's another lovely alternative, gives it a very sort of ethereal bohemian look. So yeah, you've got that option as well when it comes to the sleeves. Okay, so on to the cutting out now, and a lot of these tips are going to be quite specific to the fabrics that we've included in the kit, but I do hope it helps you to sort of think about these things, and you can use these skills when you are then making other projects in the future. So what you want to watch out for on the embroidered one is the different widths of the selvages. So you might need to try and match these up when you're folding your fabric, rather than just folding the fabric with the selvages together like you normally would, because some of the selvages will be wider than the ones in the little clip I'm going to show you. They do tend to sort of vary across the different colourways that we have. And for any pieces that are cut out on the fold, just make sure that the pattern repeat is running evenly down that fold, because you want to make sure that that looks nice and sort of straight on your finished garment. And then for some sizes, you will need to just cut the gathered sleeve on the single layer and flip it over like this. So there's not enough width in the fabric for you to cut out 2 sleeve pieces at the same time. So yeah, you can just cut one piece out, flip the pattern piece over and cut the other piece out. Now all of the fabrics are non-directional, they don't have an obvious top and bottom. So it means that to save fabric, you can have one sleeve piece going one way, and then when you flip it over, you can have it sort of facing the other way as well, and it means they can overlap a little bit more and therefore use less fabric. So the other thing that I want you to be aware of and watch out for is that if you are doing the gathered sleeve version, generally the bit of fabric that you cut out will look quite similar to the front and back bodice. So it's good to just make it clear what piece is what, and if you're just doing the plain rounded neck without the keyhole, just making it clear what is the front and back. So it might be that you pin a little note on it or something, or you just do something to the fabric to mark and identify what piece is which when you come to do it. The other thing to watch out for as well is, depending on what neckline version you're doing, just make sure you're cutting out the correct front bodice piece. So the plain neck version, the one that I've got on just now, is cut out on the fold, but then the other one with the keyhole opening, that piece is cut out, you cut out 2 separate pieces. It's not cut out on the fold for that one. So when you do come to cut out that front bodice on the version 2 keyhole opening one, you want to make sure that the seam allowance at the centre front overhangs where the embroidery is, just so that it's not as bulky in that centre front seam. So I folded the pattern piece at the centre front line, the stitch line, so that I could line this up with the edge of the embroidery. One of your fronts might be slightly more into the embroidered selvage than what I'm showing here, but really what we're aiming to do here is that, because you're going to be folding that seam allowance down the centre front back on itself twice, so that all the raw edges are hidden later, we just don't want that to become sort of too bulky and too structured. So you can just, it's just about thinking about what's going to happen to your pattern pieces after you've cut them, and then cutting them out in the most effective way. If you felt like it was easier, you could cut the 2 front bodices for the keyhole neckline individually rather than trying to cut out both together. Then just remember, you don't need to cut out the binding piece 6, because we have included that length of bias binding in the kit for you. And then you'll only need piece 9 if you're making the gathered sleeve. so you don't need to worry about cutting that out. And you'll need piece 7 if you're doing the keyhole opening. That's going to be the little buttonhole loop at the top of the neckline there. So for piece 7, I would suggest that you cut it out in the non-embroidered selvage section here, just so that, again, it's not that bulky. And also do this for the sleeve cuff if you're doing the gathered sleeve version as well. Now, generally, in terms of identifying the right and wrong side of the fabric, I would say for the blossom embroidered one, you can tell. It's probably not immediately obvious, but basically the embroidery just looks a little bit neater on the right side. On the back of the fabric, it's almost like you can see a slightly different tension in the embroidery stitches of the little stems of the flower. And then on the double gauze one, you know, if you look at the gauze itself doesn't have a right and wrong side. What's going to give it the right and wrong side is the embroidery that is on the gauze. So you want to be looking at that, and then you'll see that on the right side, the embroidery just, you know, it looks more polished and neater and flatter and smoother than it does on the back of the fabric. But maybe depending on what lighting conditions you're working in, it might be maybe that you want to stick a little pin in that as well, or attach a little note, or do something to it so that it's really nice and easily identifiable what is the right and wrong side, as well as what piece it is as well, front bodice, back bodice, sleeve, etc., as I mentioned before. And then the last cutting out tip that I've got is that if you don't have an overlocker and you're going to do French seams, which I would suggest that you do, then just cut your notches pretty small, because if you cut them too big, then it can just affect the neatness of the French seam really. So just little snips, or maybe if you've got another sort of marker, or if you want to do tailor's tacks or another way other than snipping into that seam allowance to mark your notches. Okay, now in terms of general tips, remember the seam allowance in this pattern is 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch. And then, as I mentioned before, if you don't have an overlocker to finish off your seam allowances, I would really recommend doing French seams to make it really lovely and neat on the inside, and also just to really reinforce your seams as well. The other thing that I found is that generally, as I was sewing the embroidered one, sometimes depending on sort of like the thickness of the embroidery, or maybe like if 2 flowers happen to sort of layer up on top of each other, and then effectively it's like you're going from a sort of thicker bit of fabric to a thinner bit, then the machine can get stuck on it a little bit. So I would say just take it steady when you're sewing your seams. Make sure the fabric's always feeding through the machine nice and smoothly so it doesn't get stuck on the spot. Same thing when you're starting off sewing a seam as well. If there's not, because it is quite a lightweight fabric, if you've not got enough fabric underneath the foot of the machine, sometimes the machine can struggle to sort of grip it and feed it through, and then it can kind of get stuck on the spot and feel like the machine's eating the fabric a little bit. So just starting very slightly further in from the edge can really help with that, and just give the machine more purchase onto the fabric to feed it through. And just generally make sure that you're not stretching out the fabric as you're sewing it. It can be a little bit easier to do that when you're working with raglan sleeves, or these sort of diagonal seams here, because when fabric's cut on the diagonal like that, it can just be a little bit more susceptible to stretching. So just handle the fabric nice and gently. Try not to pull on it as you're pinning it or positioning in the machine or anything. So if you're making the keyhole neckline opening, then the first thing to do will be to make your little button loop. So again, make sure that you've got water in your iron so that you've got a nice amount of steam. And then you just need to be folding and pressing that into position and top stitching it down so it's like you've got a nice little neat length that's going to be your button loop. And then you need to fold it in half. You'll have to trim it to size a little bit and just baste those ends together, ready to insert onto your neckline later. And then for preparing the front bodice for that keyhole neckline opening, you need to press the edge of the centre front once towards the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. So it's quite a narrow turning. And you want to do that all the way up the edge, and then you're going to sew the 2 front pieces together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You'll have a little slit that marks where that opening sort of ends, so just make sure you can easily see that, or it might be that you want to put a pin in to mark it so it's nice and clear. And just make sure that you back stitch at the little dots, or like where that little notch is, which is going to be the bottom of that keyhole opening. You need to make sure that you're reinforcing that point there. so that that stitching doesn't come apart later. Then you'll just press that seam open all the way up, and because you've done that first little turning, it just means that all the raw edges are enclosed all of the way up. Then you just need to attach your button loop on the right front, and you'll be attaching it to the little folded back section of the fabric, making sure that it's positioned a centimetre down so that it doesn't get caught in the binding stitch later. And what's going to end up happening is that the binding actually sort of ends up coming over the end of that little button loop later. So at the moment you're just sort of basting it in place. I actually made mine a fraction shorter than what the pattern said, because it just sort of, when I put it into position, it just seemed to like look quite long, and I thought it would maybe look a bit too long on the neckline opening. So you know, it might just maybe vary depending on like how you've pressed it or sewn it or sort of trimmed it down or whatever, but just have a little look at that when you position that little loop onto your neckline and think, oh, does it look quite long? You know, you can always sort of hold it into position and check that your button is going to go through it okay. And yeah, this is the point now where you can just shorten it a little bit, make it a little bit neater if you need to. Okay, so the next stage is attaching on your sleeves. And as I mentioned before, if you've not got an overlocker to finish off your seam allowances, or maybe you do have an overlocker but you want to do French seams anyway, then this is the point where we are going to do those French seams. Now, if you're new to French seams, don't worry, they are fairly straightforward to sew, but the main thing that you have to remember is that they do kind of, when you start sewing them, they do kind of feel like you're doing something a bit wrong, because instead of sewing right sides together, you have to first of all put the fabric wrong sides together, or wrong sides facing, and you'd sew a really narrow seam because you're going to be sewing the seam twice, so you can't sew the full seam allowance right away. So first of all, you're going to sew about 1/4 of an inch, or like a 6mm seam, and then you need to trim this down a little bit. So if you've got any sort of loose threads wisping out or kind of fraying a little bit, now is the time to trim them down. And then you need to press the seam allowances ready to sew it for the second time. So here you really need to make sure that the seam is like be nice and open and it's pressed really flat, so that by the time that you come to sew it and you flipped your fabric so that it's then right sides facing, that seam is just looking really nice and crisp and neat, and it's pressed fully open and pressed nice and flat. Then you sew the seam again with a 1cm seam allowance, or just like maybe a little bit shorter of all of that. And what that is going to do is enclose all of those raw edges. So on the inside of the garment, you effectively have like this little flap of fabric with no raw edges. And on the outside of the garment, it just looks like a regular seam. It looks really lovely and neat. So you have to repeat that process 4 times. So you're attaching your sleeves onto the front bodice and then onto the back bodice as well. And then it is on to preparing the sleeves. So if you are doing just the cuff and the regular hem, so not the gathered method, then it's much easier to press your hem into position now before you actually sew the underarm seam, because it's just easier to press something that's flat. So if you did do that alteration that I suggested in the beginning, then you will have to press the amount back by 1/2 inch and then 2 inches, so you've got that really deep hem there. And then when you do then actually come to sew the seam, you just have to open all of that out. But then when you come to actually sew the hem later, it's nice and easy because you've already got those creases and those folds in place. Then if you're doing the gathered sleeve, you'll have 2 rows of gathering stitches to sew. So these need to be on the longest stitch length setting that your machine's got. I usually go up to 5mm. Make sure that you've got nice, decent long thread tails coming out the top and the bobbin thread, and that you don't do a reverse at the start and end, because you have to be able to pull on those threads, and that's what's going to gather up the fabric later. So I would suggest doing one within the seam allowance and then one a little bit bigger than the seam allowance, so that when you pull on those threads, it just helps to keep the gathers really nice and even. So the next stage is to get the binding onto your neckline. And depending on whether you've got just the plain round version or the keyhole opening, there's sort of subtle differences in what you have to do, because in the rounded one, you need to join the ends of the binding together, but in the keyhole opening one, you're just going to be folding those edges back. Now, what I'm going to do is suggest an alternative way to put the binding on that is different from the instructions. There are lots of different ways that you can put on binding, but I find the method that I'm going to explain to you, which as I said is different from what's in the instructions, works a bit better with the double gauze binding that we have given you as part of the kit, because that double gauze binding is quite a loose open weave. It's very sort of bouncy and stretchy, and the specific width that it is, and because it's quite easy for it to stretch out and kind of move around, I did try it in the way that is in the instructions, but I just found that the results were a bit neater and sort of easier to control in the alternative method that I'm going to show you. So it does come pre-pressed with those raw edges folded into the centre, but what I'm going to ask you to do is press it completely flat, so get rid of all of them, and then you're going to press it in half, so that directly in half, so that those raw edges are together. Just be really careful when you do this that you're keeping the width of it nice and consistent. You're not sort of pulling on it or stretching it out too much as you're pressing it, just so that when you do come to put it on the neckline, you know, it's nice and even. It's got a nice, even, consistent width. So if you're making the plain neck version, you're going to sew your binding on with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, leaving a gap of about 3 inches. It says 1 inch in the instructions. I would leave it bigger than this. And you want to leave that gap at one of the back shoulder seams, and then just match up the raw edges of your binding with the neckline as you pin it on. So you should have 3 raw edges together here, and then you're going to sew that on. Once that's sewn on, you then need to open the binding out flat where it's going to join and sew the short ends together. Fold the binding like this and just put a little crease in it with the iron so you know where to sew the join. And then you just need to sew vertically down the width of the binding to join those 2 ends up. Press the seam allowances open, press it all up, and then it's like you'll have a little gap to sew in it. So you just have this little seam within the binding, and then, you know, it'll all be sewn all the way around the neckline. Then if you're doing the keyhole opening, you just want to pin your bias on all the way around, so folding it and pressing it in the same way as we did before. And at that centre front opening, you just need to fold back the edge of the binding like this at both sides, because we want to make sure that there's no raw edge right on the edge of that keyhole opening. So either way, whatever way you've done, you need to grade your seam allowances, trim them back a little bit. I found that I didn't need to clip into them. And then you want to press your binding all away from the bodice, so up and away, and just make sure your seam allowances are pointing in that direction as well. Then you're going to do a line of stitching where you're essentially sewing the binding to the seam allowance. So this is like under stitching here. You want to be pretty close to the seam line. And what this is going to do is just help your binding to stay really nice and neatly tucked inside your garment. So once you've sewn that, you then need to press the binding to the inside of the garment and really make sure that you are rolling it over to the inside here. You want to be seeing like a really fine sort of little border of the outer main fabric on the inside of the garment. And this is what's really going to make sure that your binding isn't going to peep through or sort of roll up and show on the outside of your neckline. Then you need to top stitch near the edge of the binding and really try to keep a nice even distance here from the edge of the neckline, because you'll see this line of stitching on the outside of the garment. So it might be that maybe if you're finding that you've got slight inconsistencies in the width of binding in some places, try to still stick to sewing a consistent distance from where you've turned it in, because it won't really matter too much if the binding looks slightly uneven on the inside. It's better that your top stitching that is visible from the outside of the garment looks nice and even. And you can just insert your little Me Made label in the centre back here as well. I would definitely suggest doing that if you're making the plain neck version, because it just makes it much more quicker and easy to identify which is the back and which is the front of your garment later when you come to wear it. So the next stage is to just sew the side seams, and again, if you're doing French seams, just repeat the process that I explained before, wrong sides together first, and then trim it and make sure you've pressed it really well before you sew that second pass to enclose all of those raw edges, and then you are on to your hems. So you can either do what I did, as I said in the beginning, on this blue version, where I did a bit of a thicker, deeper hem, so that was a 1/2 inch turn and then 1 inch, and I also chopped an 1.5 inches off the bottom on the blue one. or you can just hem it regularly, and that's just it's about ½ an inch, or it's about 1 centimetre twice, so it's a little bit of a narrower hem on the bottom hemline. And then for the sleeves, if you're doing that cuff version, you'll have your crease lines that you'd pressed in before, so you can just use them to press it back. You need to top stitch, just under 2 inches away from that bottom fold of the hem, and then fold the hem back to the right side by 1 inch, and then give that a press as well. So that's your little cuff formed, and then as you can see, you see the right side of the fabric, and then you could just stitch in the ditch to hold that in place in the underarm seam there. If you wanted to, you could do a little hand stitch as well, just on the inside of where the cuff is, to help it stay turned up on the other side of the sleeve as well. And then that's the same for the short sleeve and the longer 3/4 length sleeve, and then for that version you are finished. For the gathered sleeve version, you've still got to put that little cuff on. So I did the order slightly different to the instructions here. I pressed up the cuff in half lengthways, wrong sides together first, and then I pressed 1 centimetre on one of the long edges to the wrong side, and then I opened it back up again before sewing that short end of the cuff. So again, just easier to press something when it's flat rather than when it's sewn into a loop. Now I found that on the gathered sleeve version that you can see the sample that I made, it is quite loose, the gathered sleeve. There's quite a lot of room around that cuff, and if you did want that to sit a little bit tighter around your arm, what I would suggest that you do is just make it up as per the size that you're making. Sew the short end of the cuff so that you've got that loop, and then put it on your arm. Just put that little loop of fabric on your arm, and it's going to sit sort of kind of like 3/4 of the way sort of up your forearm approximately. And if you feel like it's quite loose and you want it a little bit tighter, you can just hold it in place, and you could just sew it effectively with a bigger seam allowance to make that cuff shorter. Obviously, just make sure that you can still easily get it on and off over your hand and your fist, because there's no other opening there on the cuff. But that is one thing that you could try just before you then put it onto the sleeve. Then you're going to draw up your gathers on your sleeve until it's the same size as the cuff, and pin the cuff on, just matching the seams and then the notch as well, which is like halfway round. And the instructions say to pin the right side of the cuff to the wrong side of the sleeve, but I found I got a neater finish due to this fine fabric just by sewing them right sides together. Then you just need to make sure that you adjust your gathers, you're sort of moving them all along so that they're nice and evenly distributed around your cuff. I usually put my pins in at 90 degrees to the raw edge. It's a much more accurate way to do pinning here. So once it's all pinned, you're just sewing it on with your seam allowance, and then you can remove all of those gathering stitches. You can just simply pull them out. And then you can trim your seam allowances here. I trimmed the seam allowance of the sleeve just a little bit because that was the thicker fabric. Remember, we're using just the plain flatter fabric for the cuff. And then that folded edge of the cuff just comes up and encloses all of the raw edges here. Now you could either finish this off with a hand stitch for like a really sort of clean finish, just do a little catch stitch on the inside here to secure that inner fold onto your sleeve. Or you could top stitch it, so just pinning it in place and then doing a line of top stitching just to hold that cuff into position, and then obviously you'll see that line of top stitching on your cuff. And then that is your gathered sleeve version all finished. So then the final bit is just to sew your little button on, the keyhole neckline, if you did that version. So you can just lay it all nice and flat and then see where your little loop is extending over. And then you want to just make sure that you're sewing your button sort of right at the end of that loop there, so that when it's done up, it just helps to keep that front lining up and sitting nice and flat. I was tending to just wear my versions with it done up, but I suppose you could wear it open as well if you wanted to be a little bit more relaxed around the neckline. So I hope you have found all of those hints and tips really useful and that you really enjoyed making this project. As I said in the beginning, it's such a really lovely sort of simple one, and so versatile with lots of different fabrics. So I do hope that you make loads of really nice versions with it. Just remember to share all of your makes with us. We love seeing what you make with the kits. and how you get to use them over time. If you do need any help, do reach out. You can join the private Facebook group that is for people who have bought kits or videos, and then there you can chat to lots of other people who are making the same projects as you and get any advice and suggestions there. You can always email or ring the shop as well, and the G&G team and I are always more than happy to help. But happy sewing, and I will see you next time. Bye.